The battleship Arizona is an American Pennsylvania-class battleship that entered service in 1916. Most of her career was relatively quiet. She stayed on the American East Coast during the First World War and then spent more than 20 years in peacetime service. But that quiet life suddenly ended on December 7th, 1941. At the time, Arizona was a part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed in Hawaii. As a battleship, she was a primary target for Japanese pilots during their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Several bombs hit the ship, with one of them detonating the forward magazine. She sank in a matter of minutes, claiming the lives of 1,177 men and sending the United States into the Second World War. Immediately after the attack, it was obvious that Arizona was a total loss. The U.S. Navy never tried to repair the ship or even refloat it. Instead, they salvaged what they could. For almost 2 years, divers stripped away equipment like guns and rangefinders. They recovered ordnance and cut away the superstructure, along with any other loose material they could reach. At the end of 1943, the U.S. Navy abandoned its salvage efforts, leaving Arizona as a memorial and a grave for those who were still inside. Today, Arizona is among the most visited shipwrecks in the world. Each year, more than 1 million people travel to Pearl Harbor to see the memorial, with many visitors noticing the sight and scent of oil. It is one of the shipwreck's famous features. Sailors called it the Black Tears, as if the ship was weeping for the men who died on board. Those tears were like a torrent in the days after she sank, releasing hundreds of thousands of gallons into the harbor. But even after 80 years, oil still sits in Arizona's fuel tanks. It still steadily finds its way through the ship and up to the surface. The oil can tell us a lot about the wreck. Divers cannot enter the ship, and remotely operated vehicles can only explore a small portion. So observing the oil is one helpful way to understand what is happening throughout Arizona. For example, the National Park Service regularly monitors where the oil leaks from. They found that most of it exits the ship here, around the galley area, and there's a reason for it. When we look at the wreck's profile, we can break it up into 3 sections. The first and foremost is this small part of the bow. The magazine explosion didn't reach Arizona's first few frames, so the bow is still somewhat intact. The second section is the crater left behind by the explosion. There is a hole in the decks where the blast vented through, followed by this collapsed area where the decks separated from the hull and fell into the ship. They gradually slope up until they reach the last section, the stern. Shortly after she sank, Navy divers found that everything aft of frame 78 was mostly undamaged by the explosion. It might have even been watertight enough to refloat. Arizona's galley is at the very edge of the crater, right at the top of the slope, so all the oil from the ship's boilers and ruptured fuel tanks follow the decks up towards the galley, where they begin to flatten out again. The upper deck has many cracks and fractures from the explosion and collapse. Oil either escapes directly through those cracks or filters through the sediment built up on the deck and escapes when that sediment becomes oversaturated. You may have noticed earlier in this graphic that the oil also mostly comes from Arizona's starboard side. That's because the ship is leaning to port by a few degrees, so just like how the collapsed deck funnel oil aft towards the galley, the few degrees to port tends to funnel the oil to starboard. In addition to monitoring where the oil comes from, the National Park Service also monitors how much oil escapes the ship. They notice that the amount of oil leaking around Arizona changes based on how calm the water is in the harbor. There might be very little oil on a quiet day, but there's much more on a stormy or windy day. They also noticed a connection between ships sailing by in the harbor and more sporadic oil-releasing events. What's happening here is that, as the oil moves through the wreck, it collects in pools underneath the decks. When those pools grow large enough, they will spill over to the next deck through a crack or an open hatch. However, water currents from the harbor can enter the ship, disrupting the pools and releasing much more oil than usual. We cannot see the pools in the collapsed area, but we can see them very well in the intact stern section aft of frame 78. The explosion did not damage the decks there, so there are no cracks for the oil to slip through. Instead, they pool underneath the main deck on the overhead in these officer staterooms. The National Park Service found that some pools are several inches deep and only form in the staterooms on the starboard side. Regardless, oil still finds its way out of the wreck through the stern. The most direct routes are through these open hatches near the turrets, and that's where we find something interesting. Oil degrades in water after about 30 days. When scientists studied the oil, they found it degraded everywhere except this hatch. That probably means the oil from this hatch takes less than 30 days to go from the fuel tanks to the surface, although there is a second possible explanation. The National Park Service mentions that the oil going through that hatch comes from below the third deck. The decks lower in the ship corrode much slower than those higher up, and it's because of the water currents from earlier. The second and main decks have officer and crew berthing spaces, so there are portholes all along the hull to help make the crew more comfortable. Those portholes allow the water currents from the harbor to flow through the ship, bringing in new oxygen to corrode the wreck. But below the second deck, the water current is very weak because the only way in or out is through any open hatches in the deck. So there might be pools of oil down in the lower decks that don't degrade as fast as the ones above it. Nevertheless, most oil escaping the wreck comes from those pools above the second and main decks. The degraded oil tells us the oil everywhere else on the ship has a slower journey because it's getting caught in those pools on the overheads. However, despite all of these observations and studies, there are still many things about Arizona that we don't know. The big question is, how much oil is still on board? We have a good guess at how much was in Arizona when she sank, but it's impossible to measure exactly how much she lost between 1941 and today. The magazine explosion obliterated nearly a third of the ship, and pictures in the days after she sank show a lot of oil in the water around her turrets, so the forwardmost fuel tanks are probably empty. Plus, we know the stern is intact, so it's safe to assume most of the tanks aft of Frame 78 still have oil. But where do the empty tanks end and the full tanks begin? Unfortunately, there isn't a good answer, and some estimates put as much as 600,000 gallons of oil still on board. That means, at its current rate, oil could be leaking from Arizona for hundreds of years. Luckily, Arizona isn't just one of the most visited shipwrecks in the world, it is also one of the most studied. Year after year, the National Park Service and its partners collect more data and conduct more experiments to better understand what's happening around the wreck. Hopefully, there will come a day when we can answer all of those questions, and when that day comes, I'll make a video about it, so be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell to be the first to know. Thanks for watching.